The crystal chandelier above my brother's dining table cost $47,000. I knew this because Brandon had mentioned it 14 times since I arrived. Once for each year I'd supposedly been wasting my life in the military, while he built something real. The light fractured through cut glass, casting tiny rainbows across bone china that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Each prism a small, expensive reminder that I was sitting in a world that had decided I didn't belong. I was 42 years old, and my family had spent the last 2 decades constructing an elaborate fiction about my failure. But tonight, when the Secretary of the Treasury sent a $3,000 bottle of Dom Perignon to my table and announced, "Congratulations, Major General Morgan, on your promotion to 2 stars," that carefully built narrative would shatter like the champagne flutes around me. And Brandon? He was about to discover that his failure sister earned $185,000 annually, commanded a budget exceeding $5 billion, and had quietly accumulated a net worth of $3.4 million, while he'd been drowning in debt to finance the appearance of success. As for me, I had chosen silence. 20 years of it. Because silence isn't absence. Silence is choice. Silence is strength dressed in satin, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that you were never weak. You were simply gathering your power in the dark. It started small. It always does. When I was 23 and told them I'd enlisted in the Air Force, my mother, Eleanor Morgan, Junior League president and arbiter of all things proper, went pale. Not the kind of pale that suggests shock or concern, but the kind that suggests profound social embarrassment, as if I'd announced I was joining a traveling carnival. The military. She'd said it like an obscenity, her voice dropping to that particular register wealthy women reserve for discussing bankruptcy or divorce. Darling, that's what people do when they don't have options. My father, Richard, had been more direct, his face settling into the disappointed expression I'd come to know so well. "It's a phase. She'll come back when she realizes she can't hack it." That was 1999. I never came back. Not in the way they meant. My brother Brandon, fresh from Wharton with his MBA and a Goldman Sachs offer, had laughed. Actually laughed, right there at the Sunday dinner where I'd made my announcement. "You're serious? The military? You know what a second lieutenant makes? $35,000 a year. My signing bonus is bigger than your entire starting salary." He'd turned to our father then, seeking validation. "Dad, tell her this is insane." But I'd already made my decision. The Air Force Academy had accepted me, offered me not just an education but a purpose that extended beyond quarterly earnings and corner offices. While Brandon would be optimizing portfolios, I would be serving my country. While he accumulated visible wealth, I would be accumulating something else entirely. Skills they couldn't quantify, experience they couldn't comprehend, and a security clearance so high that even explaining why I couldn't explain would violate federal law. The problem wasn't that I joined the military. The problem was that I'd refused to perform my failure for them. I didn't call home crying about basic training. I didn't quit after a year and slink back to Connecticut with my tail between my legs, ready to accept whatever entry-level position my father could secure through his network of country club connections and Ivy League alumni. I just disappeared into a career they couldn't see and therefore couldn't respect. "What exactly do you do?" my sister-in-law Melissa had asked me once, 3 Thanksgivings ago, her voice carrying that particular blend of curiosity and horror, like someone inquiring about a strange rash. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light as she refilled her wine glass. "The stone's probably worth more than my annual housing allowance." "I work in operations," I'd said, keeping my voice neutral, my expression pleasant. "Operations?" She'd repeated the word slowly, testing it for hidden meaning, her perfectly microbladed eyebrows drawing together, like factory work, manufacturing, something like that. The truth was classified. The clearance level required to know what I actually did was so astronomically high that fewer than 2,000 people in the entire United States government held it. So I'd learned to smile, to deflect, to let them construct whatever narrative made them comfortable. If they wanted to believe I was some kind of low-level administrative assistant on a military base, a glorified secretary in fatigues, pushing papers and organizing supply closets, that was fine. Let them think it. Let them pity me. Let them use my failure as a measuring stick for their own success. Because here's what they didn't know. While they were playing their games of social one-upmanship, I was playing an entirely different game. One with real stakes. One where the chips weren't stock options and luxury cars, but national security and lives. I'd graduated top of my class from the Air Force Academy, not near the top at the top, with a 3.97 GPA and a specialization in intelligence operations. At 25, I'd been selected for a program that accepted only 2% of applicants. A program so selective that being chosen was like winning a lottery where the prize was the hardest work of your life. At 27, I'd received my top secret sensitive compartmented information clearance and begun work that would shape American foreign policy for the next decade, though my family would never know it. At 32, I was a major commanding intelligence operations across 3 countries. At 37, I was a lieutenant colonel briefing 4-star generals on threat assessments that would alter military strategy in the Middle East. At 41, I'd pinned on my first star and taken command of 4,000 airmen. Their safety and readiness, my responsibility. Their lives literally in my hands during deployments that took me to places my family couldn't locate on a map. And through it all, through every promotion, every commendation, every classified briefing, with members of Congress and foreign ministers, I'd maintained the fiction. I'd shown up to family dinners in civilian clothes, my uniform packed away. I'd smiled through my mother's concerned questions about when I was going to do something with my life. I'd nodded along when my father explained how the real world works to a woman who'd spent the previous week coordinating with NATO allies on satellite imagery protocols. The mockery wasn't loud. That would have been easier to confront. It was gentle, insidious, delivered with loving concern. My mother pulling me aside at every gathering. "Are you doing okay financially, dear? If you need anything, you just have to ask. Your father knows people. It's not too late to go back to school, get a real degree in business or law. I have a master's in strategic national security, Mom." "Oh, well, yes, but those military degrees, they're not quite the same as a real MBA, are they?" Brandon had been more direct in his condescension. He'd built his identity on the visible accumulation of success markers that screamed achievement to anyone within eyeshot. The business cards with raised lettering that he distributed like calling cards at family functions. The $400 cufflinks that he worked into conversation with impressive regularity. The Tesla Model S that he parked prominently in our parents' driveway during holidays, making sure everyone saw the California plates and the sleek lines that announced arrival. He'd graduated from Wharton, done his obligatory stint at Goldman Sachs where he'd worked 80-hour weeks and earned the right to tell everyone about working 80-hour weeks, and now ran strategic partnerships at some tech startup that burned through venture capital like kindling, though he called it disrupting the enterprise solution space, with the kind of breathless enthusiasm reserved for religious converts. "She's very independent," he'd explain to colleagues when forced to acknowledge my existence. The word independent doing heavy lifting as a polite euphemism for couldn't make it in the real world. I'd watched this dynamic calcify over 20 years, each year adding another layer to the story they told about me. At my father's 60th birthday, I'd been seated at the kids' table despite being 37, while Brandon held court with the adults, discussing market trends and acquisition strategies, with the kind of confident authority that comes from never having been truly challenged. At my cousin's wedding, my mother had introduced me to her bridge club as taking some time to find herself, as if I were a wayward college student backpacking through Europe, not a woman with nearly 2 decades of military service and a security clearance that made me privy to intelligence that would give her friends nightmares. But here's what they missed, what they couldn't see through their narrow lens of what constituted success. While Brandon was accumulating debt to finance his lifestyle, I was accumulating actual wealth. At 27, I was a captain earning $68,000 plus an $18,000 housing allowance. I didn't rent an apartment in some trendy neighborhood to impress people I didn't care about. I lived on base, my housing provided, my meals subsidized. I saved 40% of my income and invested it in the thrift savings plan, the government's version of a 401k, dumping 15% of every paycheck into index funds that would compound for decades. At 32, as a major, my total compensation hit $118,000. My investment portfolio had grown to $180,000. I used a VA loan, 0% down, a benefit earned through service, to purchase a small condo in Alexandria for $285,000. Brandon spent that year buying a penthouse in Manhattan with a $2.8 million price tag and a mortgage that would take him 30 years to pay off. At 37, I was a lieutenant colonel earning $165,000 total. My portfolio had grown to $520,000. My Alexandria condo, which I'd been steadily paying down ahead of schedule, was now worth $420,000. I paid it off entirely, redirecting that mortgage payment into additional investments. Brandon spent that year trading in his Tesla for a new one because the first one was already 3 years old. At 41, I pinned on my first star and watched my total compensation climb to $205,000. My portfolio topped $1.1 million. I purchased a second condo as a rental property, paying cash, $380,000, no mortgage, no debt, just a steady stream of rental income that I rolled back into investments. Now, at 42, with my second star imminent, I earned $185,000 in base pay plus allowances that brought total compensation to $220,000. My retirement accounts and investment portfolio totaled $2.3 million. My real estate holdings, 2 condos, both paid off, one generating rental income, were worth $1.1 million. My projected military retirement after 20 years of service would pay me $9,500 monthly for the rest of my life, adjusted for inflation, with full medical benefits. Total net worth $3.4 million, total debt 0. Brandon, by contrast, earned $240,000 annually in salary. Impressive on paper. But his penthouse mortgage was $1.9 million. His car loan was $90,000. His credit card debt, accumulated through networking dinners and investment in his personal brand, hovered around $80,000. His actual net worth, when you subtracted liabilities from assets, was negative $300,000. He was, in the most literal sense, underwater. But here's the thing about people like Brandon, like my parents, like everyone at those family dinners who'd spent 20 years pitying me. They measured success by what you could see: the car in the driveway, the watch on your wrist, the square footage of your home, the brand names in your closet. They never thought to ask about debt-to-income ratios or net worth or the difference between looking wealthy and being financially secure. I wore a Seiko watch that cost $300. I'd bought it with my first paycheck as a second lieutenant 19 years ago. It still ran perfectly, keeping time with the precision that had made Seiko the official timekeeper of the Olympics. It had been with me through deployments to 6 different countries, through missions I couldn't discuss, through briefings in secure facilities where a single word to the wrong person could trigger an international incident. Patricia Patterson wore $45,000 worth of jewelry that she'd inherited from her mother. She hadn't earned it, hadn't built it, hadn't created any value to deserve it. She'd simply been born into the right family and married a man who'd been born into the right family. And somehow, in the twisted logic of my family's social circle, her inherited diamonds made her more successful than my earned security clearance. 3 months ago, at my niece's graduation party, David Patterson had cornered me by the dessert table. He was one of Brandon's venture capital friends, the kind of man who used too much hair gel and thought expensive cologne could substitute for personality. His handshake was aggressively firm, the kind of grip that announced, "I'm important," before his mouth could form the words. "So Brandon tells me you're in the service. That's really admirable." He'd loaded the word admirable with condescension, so thick I could have spread it on the crackers arrayed before us. His eyes had already dismissed me, catalogued me, filed me away in whatever mental category he reserved for people who served others instead of serving themselves. My gardener's son did that. Helped him straighten out his life. He's managing a car wash now, doing really well. I'd loaded a second piece of cake onto my plate, buying time to control my expression. The dream. The sarcasm had sailed right over his head, lost in the jet stream of his self-satisfaction. Exactly. It's all about finding your level, not everyone can be in the boardroom, someone has to do the actual work. He'd clapped me on the shoulder then, a gesture of such profound condescension that I'd briefly entertained a very detailed fantasy about the 15 different ways I could disarm and restrain him, using only the dessert fork in my hand. Techniques I'd learned in close quarters combat training, techniques designed for situations where your life depended on improvisation and speed. But I'd smiled, eaten my cake, let him return to the adults feeling magnanimous about acknowledging my small life. Because here's what David Patterson didn't know. That morning, I'd been in a Pentagon briefing room reviewing intelligence assessments on Chinese military capabilities in the South China Sea. I'd spent 4 hours with analysts and strategic planners, my input shaping recommendations that would go directly to the Secretary of Defense. A 2-star general had deferred to my analysis of satellite imagery, acknowledging my expertise in front of a room full of people who actually understood what power looked like when it wasn't wearing a Rolex. Patricia had been worse, in her own way. She'd approached me later that same afternoon, champagne making her bold, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial tone women use when they're about to deliver what they think is wisdom. I think it's wonderful that you came today. It must be hard, being around Brandon's world, all his success. Her manicured hand had touched my arm, her diamonds catching light like tiny accusations. I know you two are so different. He's built this amazing career and you've chosen such a different path. There's no shame in that. No shame in that. As if my life required her absolution. As if her approval meant anything at all. I think it's actually really brave, she'd continued, warming to her theme, clearly pleased with her own magnanimity. Not everyone is cut out for the corporate world. Some people are better with their hands, doing practical things. Like I was a particularly dedicated plumber, skilled with wrenches and drain snakes, but not quite capable of grasping the complexities of spreadsheets and conference calls. And tonight, I'd been prepared for more of the same. Brandon's email had been characteristically reluctant. Mom says I should invite you. It's at the Metropolitan Club, 8 p.m. Black tie. Try to dress appropriately. We have important clients attending. Translation. Please don't embarrass me. Please blend into the background. Please be small and quiet and forgettable so I can pretend you don't exist without actually having to explain why my sister isn't worth explaining. I debated not coming. I had actual work waiting. 3 encrypted messages requiring responses. A briefing document that needed review before tomorrow's National Security Council call. But my mother had phoned 3 times, deploying her signature blend of guilt and concern with the precision of a surgical strike. It would mean so much to your brother, dear. He's trying to include you. The least you can do is show up and be supportive. Supportive. As if I hadn't supported myself for 20 years, while they'd spent that same period constructing elaborate justifications for why my choices were wrong. So here I was, in an $850 Ralph Lauren dress that I could legally deduct from my taxes because I needed formal attire for official functions. My hair pulled back in a simple chignon, jewelry minimal, a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, the only person in my family who'd never questioned my choices. The uniform of someone trying not to be noticed, trying not to give them any ammunition for their inevitable post-event analysis of Rachel's appearance. I'd arrived at 7:30, fashionably late enough to avoid the reception line, but early enough not to be rude. The Metropolitan Club was exactly what you'd expect from a venue that catered to people who measured their worth in zeros. Marble columns that had witnessed a century of deals and backstabbing. Oil paintings of dead robber barons whose legacies their descendants still traded on. The kind of place that charged $500 just to breathe its rarefied air. Where the breadbasket cost more than most Americans spent on groceries. Brandon had spotted me almost immediately, his expression flickering through surprise, concern, and resignation in rapid succession. His wife Melissa stood beside him, her hand on his arm both possessive and steadying, her smile the kind that didn't reach her eyes. You made it. His voice had carried careful neutrality, the tone of someone greeting an obligation rather than a sister. I made it. Well, good, great. Mom will be pleased. He'd glanced around then, checking who might have seen him talking to me, his eyes cataloging the room with the practiced efficiency of someone always aware of his audience. The firm's partners are here. Try not to, I'd waited, letting the silence stretch until he had to fill it. Don't mention the military thing too much. Some of these guys are traditional. It makes things awkward. Traditional, conservative, old school, all euphemisms for men who thought women belonged in specific boxes. And military service wasn't one of the acceptable options. Never mind that women had been serving with distinction for decades. Never mind that some of the best intelligence analysts, some of the finest strategists, some of the most capable leaders I'd ever worked with were women. In Brandon's world, we were still curiosities, oddities, problems to be managed rather than colleagues to be respected. I'll talk about hobbies, I'd offered, my voice pleasant, my expression carefully neutral. Travel, the weather, anything normal. The relief on his face would have been comical if it weren't so depressing. Exactly. Perfect. Thanks, Em. He'd hurried off then, secure in the belief that he'd successfully managed the Rachel problem for another evening. I'd watched him disappear into the crowd, his shoulders relaxing now that the unpleasant task of acknowledgement was complete. The evening had proceeded exactly as expected. I'd been installed at a table near the back. Not quite hidden, but definitely not prominently displayed. The centerpiece was a tower of white roses that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance, arranged with the kind of casual extravagance that announced, "We have money, and we want you to know it." The other guests at my table were the usual suspects: corporate spouses who'd traded careers for marriages, junior associates who'd drawn the short straw on seating assignments, a few harmless middle managers who couldn't quite crack the inner circle, but were too valuable to openly snub. I'd made small talk, commented on the venue, complimented someone's earrings, played the part of Brandon's vaguely disappointing sister, who was at least trying to fit in, trying to be normal, trying not to cause problems at his important corporate event. And then they'd arrived. David and Patricia Patterson making their way through the tables like visiting royalty, stopping to greet people with the kind of practiced charm that came from years of working rooms. Patricia spotted me first, her eyes lighting up with recognition and something else, that particular gleam people get when they think they're about to perform an act of charity. "Rachel, David, look, it's Brandon's sister!" David had boomed my name like we were old friends, like he hadn't compared me to his gardener's son 3 months ago. "Patricia, this is the one I told you about." The one he'd told her about. The military one, the one who'd never figured out how to be successful, the one who served as a useful reference point for their own achievements, proof that their choices had been correct, their lives validated by my apparent failure. Patricia had slid into the seat next to me, bringing with her a cloud of perfume that probably cost more than my car payment, and a curiosity that felt more predatory than friendly. "So nice to finally meet you. Randall says you're in the Air Force." "I am." "That must be so interesting." The way she said interesting suggested she meant the opposite, the word a polite placeholder for something she couldn't quite articulate. "What do you do there exactly?" "Operations and logistics." She'd process this, trying to map it onto something she understood, her face cycling through expressions as she attempted to reconcile the words with her preconceptions. "Oh, so you help move things around? Like supplies and equipment?" Her voice had carried that emphatic sincerity people deploy when complimenting janitors or thanking waitstaff. Performative kindness that announced, "I see you as beneath me, but I'm gracious enough to acknowledge your existence anyway." "Someone has to do it, right?" "Someone does," I'd agreed, taking a long sip of water, counting to 3, reminding myself that assault charges would significantly complicate my security clearance renewal. David had jumped in then, eager to demonstrate his worldliness, his understanding of social responsibility and diversity initiatives. "I think it's great that the military is providing opportunities for women now. Even if they can't do everything the men do, there's definitely a place for them in support roles." Support roles. As if I were a secretary with a gun, filing papers and fetching coffee between ammunition counts. "How progressive," I'd said, my voice flat. Exactly. He'd missed the sarcasm entirely, too pleased with his own enlightenment to notice the edge in my tone. "And I'm sure you've learned a lot. Discipline, time management, following orders, those are transferable skills." "They are. Have you thought about what you'll do after?" Patricia had leaned forward, her expression earnest, her concern genuine in its condescension. "I mean, you can't do this forever, right? Do they help you transition to civilian jobs?" "There are programs. You should talk to Brandon." David had gestured vaguely toward where my brother stood, talking to a group of executives, all of them holding drinks and laughing at something that probably wasn't funny. "I bet he could find you something. Administrative work, maybe HR." Companies love hiring veterans for that kind of thing. Shows they're committed to social responsibility. Social responsibility. As if I were a charity case, a box to check on some corporate diversity initiative. Proof of their commitment to giving back to the less fortunate. That's very kind, I'd said, because what else could I say? How could I explain that I wasn't looking for their help, didn't need their charity, didn't want anything from them except basic human respect? How could I tell them that earlier that day, I'd been reviewing intelligence that affected the lives of millions of people? That my decisions rippled outward through channels they couldn't imagine, that the work I did in silence mattered more than every deal they'd ever closed? The conversation had drifted after that, mercifully, to safer topics. Someone's vacation to Turks and Caicos, someone else's child's acceptance to Princeton, the normal currency of this world, money, status, access, all the visible markers of success that could be name-dropped and compared and used to establish pecking order. Dinner was served. Duck with microgreens and some kind of foam made from something French and unpronounceable, arranged on the plate like abstract art. I'd eaten worse, much worse, in forward operating bases where luxury meant hoarding the good MREs, and dinner theater meant watching drone footage of targets being eliminated with surgical precision. The speeches started around 9. Brandon's CEO, a man named Buchanan who radiated self-importance like heat from asphalt, held forth about synergistic partnerships and disrupting the enterprise solution space. Everyone applauded at appropriate moments, their approval as rehearsed as his remarks. Someone made a toast to innovation that was really a toast to profit margins. Glasses clinked, ice settled in drinks. The evening rolled forward on its predetermined track. I checked my phone under the table. 3 encrypted messages, all requiring attention. One from my executive officer about a scheduling conflict for next week's StratCom meeting. One from the J2 shop requesting input on an assessment brief. One from my aide reminding me about tomorrow's 7 a.m. call with National Security Council staff. I'd handled them quickly, thumbs flying over the secure messaging app, responses terse but complete. The phone had disappeared back into my purse before anyone noticed. Another secret among thousands. Another piece of my actual life hidden behind the fiction they preferred. And that's when Patricia had decided to escalate from condescension to intervention. I'd noticed her watching me, that specific kind of female attention that feels like judgment being rendered in real time, a verdict forming behind carefully mascaraed eyes. She'd been drinking steadily since they arrived, champagne loosening her tongue and amplifying her conviction that she was helping, that her words were a gift rather than an insult. "You know," she'd said, leaning in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to that register women use when they're about to share something important. "I think it's wonderful that you came tonight." I'd set down my dessert fork, recognizing the tone, bracing for whatever came next. It must be hard being around Brandon's world, all his success. She'd paused, letting that land, making sure I understood that she'd noticed the disparity, acknowledged the gap between my brother's achievements and my own presumed lack thereof. "I mean, you two are so different. He's built this amazing career, and you've chosen such a different path. There's no shame in that." There it was again, no shame. The absolution I hadn't requested, didn't need, didn't want. "I don't feel any shame," I'd said evenly, my voice calm, my expression neutral. "Of course not." Her hand had found my arm again, squeezing gently. Her touch meant to comfort, to connect, to deliver what she imagined was compassion. I think it's actually really brave. Not everyone is cut out for the corporate world. Some people are better with their hands, doing practical things. Practical things. She'd already said that once today, at the earlier reception. Apparently, it was her go-to explanation for my life, her way of categorizing people who didn't fit her narrow definition of success. David had nodded enthusiastically, warming to the theme, ready to deliver what I recognized as a movie quote, though I couldn't place the reference. "Absolutely, the world needs ditch diggers too, right?" He'd laughed at his own joke, pleased with himself, oblivious to how he sounded, how they both sounded. Two people so insulated by wealth and privilege that they'd lost the ability to hear their own condescension. I'd opened my mouth to respond, had something particularly sharp loaded and ready, years of accumulated frustration finally about to find release, when I'd heard footsteps approaching our table. The waiter appeared at my elbow, young and professionally polite, carrying a bottle that I immediately recognized as absurdly expensive. Dom Perignon, vintage 2008, the kind of champagne that required a second mortgage to purchase, that showed up at weddings and White House dinners and nowhere else. He'd set a fresh glass in front of me with practiced precision, the crystal catching light, refracting it across the table. His hands were steady as he poured, the pale gold liquid rising in the flute with perfect consistency. And then he'd said the words that would detonate the evening, that would shatter 20 years of careful fiction, that would force them all to see what they'd spent 2 decades refusing to acknowledge. "Compliments of the Secretary of the Treasury, ma'am." He says congratulations on the promotion. The table had gone silent, not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that suggests the world has stopped rotating, that gravity has temporarily suspended its hold, that everything familiar has suddenly become foreign. Patricia had frozen mid-reach for her own glass, her face locked in an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. David's jaw had slackened, his mouth opening slightly as his brain struggled to process words that didn't fit his understanding of reality. And Brandon, my brother Brandon, who'd spent 20 years managing my embarrassment, who'd seated me at the back table, who'd warned me not to mention the military, had gone absolutely white, all color draining from his face like someone had opened a valve. "I'm sorry," Patricia had said slowly, each word carefully enunciated, as if the precision might help her understand. "The Secretary of the Treasury?" The waiter had nodded, already backing away, his job complete, his role in the evening's drama finished. "Yes, ma'am, he's at table 7. He asked me to convey his congratulations to Brigadier General Morgan on her recent promotion to Major General." And there it was. 20 years of careful silence, shattered. 20 years of deflection ended. 20 years of letting them construct their comfortable fiction about my failure, destroyed by a single sentence from a man I'd briefed twice in the last 6 months about cyber threats to the financial sector, whose respect I'd earned through competence rather than inheritance, whose recognition meant something because it was based on merit rather than bloodline. David's jaw had literally dropped. Actually, physically dropped, his mouth hanging open like a cartoon character's, words failing him completely for perhaps the first time in his privileged life. Patricia had blinked rapidly, her champagne-fueled confidence evaporating, confusion replacing certainty as she tried to reconcile the words she'd just heard with the woman she'd been pitying for the last hour. "Major General?" Her voice had come out small, uncertain, stripped of its earlier conviction. "2 stars," I'd confirm pleasantly, taking a sip of the champagne. It was excellent, as expected, complex and perfectly balanced, the kind of quality that came from decades of refinement. Technically, the promotion doesn't take effect until January, but yes. Brandon hadn't said anything, hadn't said a single word. He'd just stared at me as if I'd suddenly materialized from another dimension, which in a sense I had, because the Rachel they knew, the one who worked in operations, who did practical things, who was better with her hands, she didn't exist. She never had. She was a phantom they'd created, a projection of their need to feel superior, to believe their choices were the only valid ones, to measure success only by metrics they could understand. The real Rachel, the one who'd graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy, who'd spent a decade in intelligence operations, who'd commanded at every level from flight to wing, who'd deployed to 6 different countries, who'd held a top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance since she was 27, who'd been selected for flag rank at 41, making her one of the youngest generals in the Air Force. She'd been here all along. They just couldn't see her. "But you..." Patricia had started, then stopped, her brain rebooting, trying again. "You said you worked in logistics." "I said operations and logistics," I'd corrected gently, my voice carrying no anger, no triumph, just simple accuracy. Which is technically correct. I command operational forces. The logistics are just part of it. Command. David had repeated the word weakly, testing it, finding it foreign on his tongue. "Approximately 4,000 personnel across multiple installations," I'd clarified, taking another sip of the champagne, savoring it now, allowing myself this small moment of satisfaction. Give or take, depending on deployment cycles. The silence had spread outward from our table, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Other guests had noticed the champagne delivery, the waiter's announcement, the sudden frozen tableau at our table. People were leaning in, whispering, and then from across the room, I'd heard the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping back against marble. Secretary Harrison was making his way toward us, moving through the crowd with the confident ease of someone who knew his presence commanded attention. He was a serious man, former Wall Street executive turned public servant, someone who understood both worlds and chose service over profit. We'd worked together on the Joint Task Force for Financial Sector Security, spent hours in classified briefings discussing vulnerabilities and countermeasures, built mutual respect through shared commitment to protecting systems most people never thought about. General Morgan, he'd extended his hand as he reached our table, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space. I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to congratulate you personally before I left for the evening. I'd stood, shaken his hand, aware of every eye in the room now turned toward us, watching this interaction, trying to understand what it meant. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, that's very kind. Not at all. Your work on the Joint Task Force has been exceptional. The President specifically mentioned it in our last cabinet meeting. The President? I'd watched Brandon's face cycle through white to red and back to white again, each color representing a different stage of realization, a different piece of his worldview crumbling. Secretary Harrison had nodded politely to the table, then returned to his party, but the damage, or rather the revelation, was complete. Every eye in the room was now on our table, on me, whispers starting immediately, spreading like wildfire through the crowd. General, 2 stars. Did he say the President? That's Brandon Morgan's sister. The one who, I thought she... Patricia had been staring at me like I'd grown a second head, her entire understanding of reality requiring fundamental revision. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you? I'd taken another sip of champagne, let the question hang in the air for a moment, considered my response carefully. You never asked. Not really. You asked what I did and I told you. Operations. You just heard what you wanted to hear. But you let us think. I let you think whatever made you comfortable. I'd kept my voice even, not angry, not triumphant, just factual, just honest. You decided what my life looked like based on your own assumptions. I just didn't correct you. David had found his voice, though it came out strangled, desperate. You're a general, a 2-star general. As of January, yes. And before, what were you before? 1-star general. Before that, full colonel. Before that, lieutenant colonel. It's a fairly standard progression. Jesus Christ. Brandon had whispered it, the words barely audible, his face still cycling through expressions as his brain tried to process, to reconcile, to understand how he'd been so completely, fundamentally wrong about his own sister for 20 years. The weight of that silence, of that realization, settled over our table like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable, changing everything it touched. You could have told me. Brandon's words finally broke the silence, his voice carrying something I hadn't heard from him in years. Uncertainty. All these years, you could have said something. I'd looked at my brother, really looked at him. At the expensive Tom Ford suit that probably cost $3,000. At the careful hair that required monthly maintenance at some exclusive salon. At the entire performance of success that he'd constructed his identity around. The architecture of his self-worth was visible in every detail. From the Hermes tie to the Ferragamo shoes, each piece screaming achievement to anyone who knew how to read the signals. Could I have? My voice had stayed level, curious rather than accusatory. Would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was lying, making it up to compete with you? He'd opened his mouth, then closed it. We both knew the answer. We both understood that in a family where success was measured in visible accumulation, where achievement required an audience, my claims would have sounded like fantasy. A general, Rachel? The same Rachel who lived in a small condo in Alexandria and drove a 7-year-old Honda? Impossible. She must be delusional, confused, desperate for attention. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 20 years of misunderstanding, of assumptions, of comfortable fictions that had just been incinerated by a single bottle of champagne and a cabinet secretary's casual recognition. Patricia had stood abruptly, her chair scraping against marble with a sound like fingernails on glass. I need to... "Excuse me, I need the restroom." She'd fled, practically running, her designer heels clicking rapidly against the floor as she escaped what must have felt like a nightmare, reality inverting itself, her worldview collapsing. David had followed moments later, mumbling something about checking on his wife, unable to meet my eyes. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. And then it was just Brandon and me, sitting at a table scattered with half-eaten desserts and the ruins of his understanding of our family, of success, of what mattered. "Why didn't you tell us?" he'd asked again, his voice smaller now, stripped of its usual authority. "Mom and Dad, they don't know either, do they?" "No. Why?" I'd considered the question, the real question beneath it. Not why I'd kept my rank classified. That was standard security protocol at certain levels, protection for both myself and the operations I commanded. But why I'd let them all believe I was nothing, nobody, a failure who'd never figured out how to succeed in the real world. 'Cause you needed me to be, all of you. The truth had settled over us like ash from a distant fire, covering everything, changing the landscape. You needed someone to compare yourselves against, someone who'd made the wrong choices so you could feel better about your own. And it was easier to let you have that than to fight you on it every single day for 20 years. That's still not fair. Isn't it? I'd met his eyes, held them, refused to let him look away from this. "When's the last time you asked about my work?" Really asked, wanting to know the answer. "When's the last time any of you considered that maybe I had reasons for my choices? That maybe my life was exactly what I wanted it to be?" He looked away first, unable to sustain that confrontation with his own behavior, with the pattern he'd participated in for 2 decades. Around us, the gala continued, but our corner of it had become its own separate reality. A pocket dimension where the rules had changed, where the hierarchy had inverted. People were still watching, still whispering, the news spreading through the room with viral efficiency. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Brandon's professional circle would know. His embarrassing sister, his failure sibling, was actually a 2-star general. The narrative he'd been trading on, the comparison that had made him feel successful, had just been exposed as fiction. "I love what I do, Brandon." The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they carried weight, truth that couldn't be dismissed or diminished. "I love serving. I love the work. I love the mission. I don't need a corner office or a 7-figure salary or a business card with raised lettering to feel like my life matters." I'd paused, gathering the thoughts I'd been carrying for 20 years, finally given permission to speak them aloud. "I have 4,000 airmen whose safety and readiness depend on me. I brief members of Congress. I work with allies across 5 continents. I help protect our country from threats you don't even know exist." Another pause, this one heavier, loaded with accumulated hurt finally finding release. "And you all decided that because you couldn't understand it, because you couldn't see it, because it didn't fit your definition of success, it must not be worth doing." The truth of it landed between us, undeniable, transforming everything it touched. Brandon's face had cycled through several expressions: denial, recognition, shame, grief for lost years and broken connections. "I'm sorry." The words came out barely audible, his voice breaking on them. We should have." "Yes, you should have." The acknowledgement hung in the air, insufficient but necessary. The first step towards something that might eventually resemble understanding. I should go. I'd stood, collected my small clutch purse, checked my phone one final time. 3 more encrypted messages had arrived during dinner, each one requiring decisions that affected operations across multiple time zones. "I have an early call tomorrow, National Security Council." Brandon had just nodded, beyond words now, watching as I prepared to leave, to return to my actual life, the one he'd never bothered to learn about. I'd walk toward the exit, aware of every eye tracking my movement, whispers following like a wake behind a boat. At the door, I'd glanced back one final time. Brandon was still sitting there, staring at nothing in particular, his world quietly rearranging itself around this new, impossible truth. His sister wasn't a failure. She never had been. She'd just been succeeding in a language he'd never learned to speak. The car service had dropped me off at my Alexandria apartment at 11:47. I texted my aide that I was home safe, standard protocol for flag officers. Someone always needed to know our location and status. and poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon. Not expensive bourbon, not the kind you serve to impress guests, just good solid American whiskey that did its job without pretense. My phone had buzzed immediately. My mother. I'd let it go to voicemail, not ready for that conversation, not willing to engage with her shock and confusion and inevitable demands for explanation. It buzzed again, a text from Brandon. We need to talk, really talk. I'd type back slowly, each word deliberate. Tomorrow, after my NSC call. Then I turned off my phone completely, changed into comfortable clothes, old Air Force Academy sweatpants and a faded t-shirt from my first deployment, and sat on my couch in the dark, bourbon in hand, letting the evening replay in my mind like a mission debrief, analyzing every moment, every reaction, every consequence. The look on Patricia's face when the waiter had announced my rank. The strangled sound David had made when I'd confirmed the numbers. 4,000 personnel, $5 billion in budget authority, direct access to the president's national security team. Secretary Harrison's casual mention of the cabinet meeting, dropping that detail like it was nothing, like it was normal to have the commander-in-chief specifically reference my work. And Brandon's jaw, literally hanging open as his entire understanding of reality restructured itself around new data points he couldn't ignore or dismiss or explain away. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated. 20 years of being small in their eyes, and now suddenly I was large, visible, undeniable. Justice served cold on a silver platter, with a $3,000 bottle of champagne as garnish. But mostly I just felt tired, exhausted by the weight of carrying their misconceptions, by the effort of maintaining the fiction, by the loneliness of being fundamentally unseen by the people who were supposed to know me best. 20 years of swallowing my pride, my accomplishments, my truth, because it was easier than confronting their need to see me as less than, because it was simpler to let them have their comfortable narrative than to force them to examine their own prejudices, their own narrow definitions of success, their own fear of anything that didn't fit their predetermined categories. The bourbon had burned going down, familiar and warming, uncomplicated in its purpose. Tomorrow would bring complications. My mother's calls, my father's confused attempts at understanding, Brandon's need to process and analyze and somehow integrate this new sister into his worldview. But tonight I was just Rachel Morgan, Major General Select, sitting in her apartment drinking good bourbon and feeling the weight of 20 years of silence finally lift. My phone had buzzed one more time before the ringer went silent. A text from a number I recognized immediately. Colonel Martinez, my peer and friend, someone who understood both the demands of our work and the isolation it created. Saw what happened at the Met Club tonight. Secretary's office is texting everyone. You're famous. Congratulations on the promotion. You earned it. I'd smiled at that, set the phone down, finished my bourbon. Famous. After 20 years of invisibility by choice, I was suddenly famous. The irony was sharp enough to cut. But tomorrow, I'd wake at 5:30, put on my uniform, and brief the National Security Council on critical intelligence assessments related to cyber vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. I'd do my job, the job I'd been doing all along, regardless of whether my family could see it, understand it, or value it. The job that mattered because it protected people who would never know my name, never thank me, never understand that their peaceful sleep depended on people like me working in the shadows. And if Patricia and David and all the other people at that gala had to recalibrate their understanding of success, if they had to confront the uncomfortable truth that worth isn't measured in stock options and Manhattan penthouses and $45,000 inherited jewelry, well, that was their problem to solve, not mine. I'd spent 20 years solving bigger ones. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray November light that made Washington feel particularly bureaucratic. The sky the color of filing cabinets, the air carrying that specific chill that promised winter without quite delivering it. I'd woken at 5:30 out of habit, my body trained by 2 decades of military discipline to rise regardless of circumstances, regardless of how late the previous night had run. The apartment was quiet, just the sound of the coffee maker gurgling to life, and the distant hum of early morning traffic filtering up from the street below. I'd showered, dressed in my uniform, the Air Force Service dress blues with 2 stars gleaming on the shoulders, the ribbons on my chest representing deployments and commendations that most civilians would never understand, and reviewed my briefing notes for the 7 a.m. call. Cyber threats to financial infrastructure, coordinated attacks originating from state actors, vulnerabilities in clearinghouse systems, recommendations for enhanced protection protocols, dense technical material that required fluency in both strategic thinking and operational detail, the kind of work that existed at the intersection of technology, policy, and national security. My aide had knocked at 6:15, punctual as always, carrying additional classified documents that had arrived overnight. Major Chen was young, sharp, competent. She'd make flag rank herself someday if she stayed the course. Ma'am, you have 47 messages from last night. Most of them are family-related. And some media inquiries. Media? Apparently, the story from the Metropolitan Club has reached some outlets. Junior reporters covering the business scene noticed Secretary Harrison's public congratulations. They're asking for confirmation of your rank and position. I'd sighed, recognizing the inevitable cascade of attention that came from stepping out of the shadows, even accidentally. Standard response: refer all media inquiries to public affairs. My rank and position are a matter of public record, but I don't give interviews about my work. Yes, ma'am. Also, your mother has called the office 3 times. Tell her I'll call after the NSC brief. The call itself had been intense but routine. 90 minutes of high-density information exchange with representatives from Homeland Security, Treasury, NSA, and the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator. Technical discussions of attack vectors and defensive measures, policy debates about information sharing between agencies, strategic questions about how to protect systems without stifling innovation or triggering market panic. I'd presented my recommendations clearly, backed by data from my intelligence teams, supported by analysis that had taken weeks to compile. The National Security Advisor had asked sharp questions. I'd answered them. By 8:30, we had consensus on the path forward, and I had action items that would keep my teams busy for the next quarter. Major Chen had been waiting when I'd emerged from the secure conference room, her expression suggesting news I wouldn't enjoy. General, your family situation has escalated. Your mother called again. Your brother called twice. And your father called once, which Major Chen understood was significant because Richard Morgan rarely called anyone. He expected to be called. I'd nodded, accepting the inevitable. Get me a line to my parents' house. The call had connected quickly, and my mother's voice had filled my ear before I could even finish my greeting, her words tumbling out in a torrent of confusion and accusation and hurt feelings all tangled together. Demi, Rachel, whatever you want to be called, Brandon called last night. He was incoherent. Something about generals and the Treasury Secretary and she'd paused to catch her breath, and I'd heard my father's voice in the background, equally agitated though more controlled. Why didn't you tell us, your own mother? I had to hear from Brandon that my daughter is some kind of general. Is that even real? How is that possible? It's real, Mom. But you said you worked in, what did you say, operations? That sounds like you were in a warehouse somewhere. I commanded operations. It's different. How different? How different can it be? You never mentioned, you never said. I couldn't, Mom. Security protocol. A lot of what I do is classified. Classified. She'd repeated the word like it was foreign, incomprehensible. Your father says people who work with classified information are spies. Are you a spy? I'm an intelligence officer, not a spy. There's a distinction. My father had taken the phone then, his voice carrying that particular quality of a man accustomed to being in control, suddenly finding himself completely out of his depth. Rachel, we need to understand this. Brandon says you command thousands of people. He says you have a budget in the billions. He says the Secretary of the Treasury knows you personally. All accurate. And you never thought to mention this? Not once in 20 years? I'd closed my eyes, gathering patience, trying to find words that would bridge the canyon of misunderstanding that had opened between us decades ago, and only widened with time. I tried, Dad. When I graduated from the academy, I told you I'd finished first in my class. You said that was nice, but it wasn't the same as a real degree from a real school. When I made captain, I mentioned I'd been selected for a special program. You asked when I was going to get a real job. When I deployed to Afghanistan, I told you I'd be gone for a year. You asked if I'd thought about going to business school instead. But that's not the same as telling us you were, what are you exactly? Major General 2 stars, effective January 1st. The silence on the other end of the line had stretched long enough that I'd wondered if we'd been disconnected. Then my father had spoken again, his voice quieter, carrying something that might have been realization or might have been shame. We didn't know. We should have asked. We should have wanted to know. Yes, you should have. My mother had taken the phone back, her voice thick now, emotion breaking through the shock. I told Martha Henriksen that you were still finding yourself. I told the entire bridge club that you were working in some kind of administrative position because you didn't have the qualifications for anything better. I was embarrassed of you, Rachel, my own daughter, and I was embarrassed. The confession had hung between us, raw and painful, the kind of truth that once spoken couldn't be taken back, couldn't be softened, could only be acknowledged and somehow survived. I know, Mom, I've always known. How could you just let us think that? How could you let us be so wrong? Because you needed to be right more than I needed to be seen. And because fighting you every day for 20 years seemed more exhausting than just living my life and letting you think what you wanted. The words had come out harsher than I'd intended, but they were true. And I was tired of softening truth to make it more palatable. We need to talk about this. All of us. Your father and I, Brandon, we need to have a real conversation. I checked my watch. I had a meeting with my command staff in 30 minutes. A working lunch with the J2 shop to review intelligence requirements, and an afternoon full of briefings that couldn't be postponed. This weekend, Saturday dinner, I'll come to you. There'd been relief in her voice when she'd agreed, gratitude that I wasn't cutting them off entirely, that there was still a possibility of repair, however complicated the path forward might be. The rest of the day had blurred past in a cascade of meetings and decisions, and the normal operational tempo of commanding 4,000 people across multiple installations. But under it all, threading through every conversation and every brief, was the knowledge that my secret was out, my carefully maintained fiction was destroyed, and everything between me and my family would have to be rebuilt from scratch, if it could be rebuilt at all. By Friday afternoon, the full scope of the fallout had become clear. The story had spread beyond my immediate family, rippling outward through Brandon's professional network, through my parents' social circle, through the interconnected web of wealthy Connecticut families who'd known me as the disappointing Morgan daughter, who'd never lived up to her potential. Major Chen had compiled a summary of the communications we'd received, her face carefully neutral as she'd presented it. 17 messages from family friends requesting confirmation. 8 from your brother's professional contacts. Your mother's bridge club has apparently discussed nothing else all week. And Patricia Patterson called personally. Patricia, that was unexpected. What did she want? To apologize. She was... Major Chen had paused, searching for the right word. Emotional. She used the word mortified 6 times in a 3-minute voicemail. I'd felt something then. Not quite satisfaction, but maybe its quieter cousin. Vindication. Patricia, who'd patted my hand and talked about practical things and finding my level, confronting the reality that she'd been spectacularly, fundamentally wrong about who I was and what my life meant. Any response required? That's your call, ma'am. Though for what it's worth, she did sound genuinely distressed. I'd considered it, weighing the costs and benefits of engagement versus silence, of extending grace versus maintaining distance. No response needed. She can sit with her discomfort. Maybe it'll teach her not to make assumptions about people based on their profession or their choice to live quietly. Major Chen had nodded, understanding implicit in her expression. She'd been a minority woman in a male-dominated field long enough to recognize the dynamics at play, the casual condescension that people like Patricia deployed without even recognizing it as condescension. There is one other call you should know about. Which one? David Patterson. He called your office directly, bypassed the switchboard, apparently pulled some strings to get your number. He wanted to apologize for the gardener's son comment. I'd actually laughed at that, a short bark of genuine amusement. The gardener's son who'd learned discipline and purpose and the meaning of service. The son who'd turned his life around through military structure and was now managing a business and supporting his family. David had meant it as an insult, comparing me to someone who'd needed the military to become functional. never realizing that he'd actually been describing exactly the kind of transformation that mattered. Someone finding purpose and direction and self-respect through service to something larger than themselves. What did you tell him? That your schedule is fully committed for the foreseeable future. Good answer. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of November day where autumn finally admitted defeat and let winter claim the field. I'd driven up to Connecticut in my Honda, the same reliable car I'd owned for 7 years. Its lack of pretense somehow more pointed now that my family knew I could afford something flashier. I could have bought a Mercedes or a BMW, could have signaled wealth the way Brandon did. But I'd never seen the point. The Honda got me where I needed to go. It was reliable, efficient, practical. It did its job without requiring validation from strangers. My parents' house sat at the end of a long driveway in Greenwich, the kind of establishment that announced generational wealth without being vulgar about it. 6 bedrooms, manicured grounds, the gentle evidence of prosperity maintained through careful management and conservative investment strategies. This was where I'd grown up, where I'd learned that success had a specific shape, and anything outside that shape was failure. Brandon's Tesla was already in the driveway when I arrived. Of course it was. He'd want to be there first, to establish himself, to prepare our parents for my arrival, to maintain whatever control he could over a situation that had already spun far beyond his ability to manage. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her face cycling through several expressions in rapid succession. Relief that I'd actually come, uncertainty about how to greet me, something that might have been pride fighting with something that might have been grief. "Sweetheart, you came. I said I would." She'd stepped aside to let me in, and I'd been immediately struck by how little had changed in the 2 decades since I'd left. The same furniture, the same artwork, the same subtle markers of wealth and taste that had surrounded my childhood. This house was a time capsule, preserved in amber, resistant to change. "Your father and Brandon are in the study. Would you like something to drink first? Coffee? Tea?" "I'm fine, Mom. Let's just do this." The study was exactly as I remembered. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, the smell of old books and furniture polish, and decisions made from positions of inherited comfort. My father sat in his usual chair, Brandon on the couch, both of them rising when I entered, their body language uncertain, as if they weren't sure what the protocol was for greeting someone they'd just discovered they'd never actually known. "Rachel." My father's voice carried weight, formality, the tone of a man approaching a difficult business negotiation. "Thank you for coming." I'd nodded, taken a seat in the chair across from them, positioned myself deliberately to make this feel less like an interrogation, and more like an actual conversation between equals, though we'd have to see if they could actually manage that. Brandon looked like he hadn't slept well all week. His eyes were shadowed, his usual polish slightly dimmed. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its normal confidence. I've been thinking about what you said, about how we needed you to fail so we could feel successful, about how we never asked what you actually did." He'd paused, swallowed hard. It continued. "You were right. I used you as a reference point. Every time I felt insecure about my choices, about whether what I was doing mattered, I could look at you and think, at least I'm not in her situation." The honesty was startling, painful, necessary. This was Brandon without his armor, without his performance, just a man confronting the ugliness of his own behavior. "But you weren't in his situation. You are more successful than I ever dreamed of being. And I couldn't see it because I decided what success looked like, and anything that didn't match my definition didn't count." My father had leaned forward then, his hands clasped, his expression carrying the weight of 7 decades of certainty now cracked by new information. "Help us understand, Rachel. Not just what you do, but why. Why you chose this, why you stayed, why you let us be so wrong for so long." And so I told them. Not the classified parts, not the operational details, not the specifics of missions and targets and intelligence assessments that would remain sealed for decades, but the rest of it, the why. I chose service because I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. I wanted work that mattered beyond quarterly profits and market share. I wanted to know that what I did every day contributed to keeping people safe, to protecting the systems that let everyone else sleep peacefully at night, oblivious to the threats that never materialized because people like me were standing watch. I'd paused, gathering thoughts that had been forming for 20 years, finally given space to breathe. I stayed because I was good at it. Because I found that I had skills and instincts that made me valuable in this world. Because every promotion, every new responsibility, every challenge met and overcome proved to me that I'd made the right choice, even if you all couldn't see it. And you let us be wrong because fighting you seemed impossible. Because every time I tried to explain, you had already decided what my life meant. When I graduated top of my class, you said it was nice, but not like a real school. When I deployed overseas, you asked when I'd get a real job. When I briefed members of Congress, I couldn't tell you because it was classified, so you assumed I was filing paperwork in a basement somewhere. The words had come faster now, 20 years of frustration finding voice. It was easier to let you have your fiction than to spend every family dinner defending choices you'd already decided were wrong. It was simpler to be small in your eyes than to constantly fight for recognition you refused to give. My mother had spoken then, her voice breaking. We failed you. We were so busy being disappointed that you hadn't chosen the life we wanted for you, that we never asked if you were happy with the life you'd chosen. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with all the years between us, all the missed opportunities for connection, all the damage done by comfortable assumptions. Are you? My father's question was quiet, genuine. Happy with your life? I'd thought about it, really considered it, because the answer mattered and deserved honesty. Yes, I love my work, I love serving. I love knowing that what I do matters, even if most people never know it happened. I love the responsibility, the challenge, the mission. I have 4,000 people depending on me. I protect systems that billions of people rely on without knowing they exist. I help shape strategy that keeps our country safe. I'd looked at each of them in turn, making sure they heard what came next. I don't need your validation to know my life has value. I never did. But I would have liked your respect. I would have liked you to be curious enough to actually see me instead of the version of me that fit your narrative. Brandon had been crying, actually crying, tears running down his face unchecked. I'm so sorry, Em, for all of it, for every assumption, every comparison, every time I made you feel small so I could feel big. My father had cleared his throat, clearly struggling with emotion he wasn't practiced at expressing. I was proud of myself for graduating Yale, for building my company, for providing this life for your mother. But Rachel, you've served your country at the highest levels. You've commanded thousands. You've advised presidents. That's something I could never do. Something I never even imagined trying to do. He'd paused, his voice roughening. I'm proud of you. I should have said it 20 years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of my daughter, the general. The words had landed in the space between us, imperfect but real, beginning something that might eventually become healing if we were all willing to do the work. I don't know if we can fix this. My voice had stayed steady, honest. 20 years is a long time to be unseen, a long time to be diminished, a long time to carry the weight of your disappointment. But if we're going to try, here's what I need from all of you. I'd laid out the terms then, the boundaries, the requirements for moving forward. No more assumptions, no more dismissals, no more treating my career as less meaningful than Brandon's, because mine came with confidentiality instead of publicity. Respect for my expertise, my experience, my choices. Acknowledgement that success takes many forms, and mine was just as valid as theirs, even if it looked different. They'd agreed to all of it. Whether they could follow through, whether old patterns could actually change, remained to be seen. But at least now we had a starting point. At least now the truth was visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. The conversation had stretched for hours, through lunch, into the afternoon. Stories I'd never told because no one had asked. Explanations of career progression they'd never understood because they'd never tried. Bridges tentatively constructed across canyons of misunderstanding, fragile but present. When I'd finally driven away as evening fell, my phone had buzzed with a text from Brandon. Thank you for giving us another chance. We don't deserve it, but I'm grateful for it. I'd smiled at that, tired but somehow lighter. the burden of 2 decades of silence finally shared instead of carried alone. The world hadn't changed. I'd still wake Monday morning and brief senior leaders on classified threats. I'd still command thousands of people whose names my family would never know. I'd still serve in the shadows, my work invisible to most, understood by few. But at least now my family knew. And maybe, eventually, that would be enough. 3 months had passed since the Metropolitan Club incident. That's what my family called it now. As if it were a natural disaster or diplomatic crisis, rather than simply the truth finally demanding recognition. Winter had settled over Washington with characteristic gray determination, the kind of cold that seeped into buildings and bones, making everything feel harder, more effortful. My promotion had become official on January 3rd, a quiet ceremony at the Pentagon attended by senior officers and defense officials, none of my family present because they'd asked if they could come and I'd said not yet. Some transitions required privacy, space to become real without an audience demanding emotional performance. The 2 stars on my shoulders carried weight beyond their physical mass, the weight of increased responsibility, of heightened visibility, of expectations that came with being one of fewer than 50 women to ever reach this rank in the Air Force. Every decision I made now rippled further, affected more people, carried consequences that extended beyond my immediate command. But the weight I'd been carrying for 20 years, the weight of being invisible, of being misunderstood, of being diminished, that weight had finally lifted. And I was still discovering what it felt like to move through the world without it. My mother had called every Sunday since that difficult Saturday in Greenwich. Not the obligatory calls from before, laden with passive-aggressive concern and thinly veiled disappointment, but actual conversations. She'd asked about my work, carefully, respecting boundaries around classified information, but genuinely curious about the parts I could discuss. She'd wanted to understand the path I'd taken, the choices I'd made, the life I'd built that she'd never bothered to see. During one of those calls, she'd confessed something that had surprised me. I found your citation for the Defense Superior Service Medal. Your father had it framed years ago, but kept it in his study where no one could see it. I think he was proud, but didn't know how to show it. Didn't know how to square it with his disappointment that you hadn't chosen business or law. The revelation had hit harder than expected. Evidence that some part of them had always known, had always recognized value in what I did, but couldn't reconcile that recognition with their rigid definitions of success. The cognitive dissonance had been resolved by hiding the evidence, rather than examining their assumptions. Brandon had been worse in some ways, better in others. Worse because his guilt was consuming him, driving him to overcorrect in ways that felt performative rather than authentic. He'd tried to get me on CNBC to discuss leadership. He'd suggested I should write a book about my career. He'd wanted to host a party to properly introduce me to his professional network, as if I were a product being launched rather than a person who'd existed all along. But better because underneath the performance, there was genuine remorse. He'd taken me to lunch 3 weeks after the Connecticut meeting, a quiet place in Arlington, no photographers, no networking opportunities, just us in a booth talking without an audience. I've been in therapy. His words had come out quickly, embarrassed. Since that night, since I realized I'd spent 20 years using you as a measuring stick to make myself feel successful. That's good. It's good. Therapy's good. The therapist asked me why your success threatened me so much. Why I needed you to be less so I could be more. What did you tell her? That I was afraid that if you could succeed without following the script, without the MBA, without Wall Street, without the visible accumulation of wealth, then maybe the script I'd followed wasn't as important as I'd convinced myself it was. Maybe I'd sacrifice things that mattered for things that just looked impressive. He'd paused, his coffee untouched, his hands restless on the table. I have $2.1 million in debt, Em. The penthouse, the car, the lifestyle. I earn well, but I spend more. I'm underwater. And you have more net worth than I'll probably ever have, and you did it without leverage, without risk, without any of the things I thought were necessary for wealth building. The admission had cost him something. Brandon didn't do vulnerability well, didn't like acknowledging weakness or failure, or the gap between appearance and reality. I'm not saying your way is better or my way is wrong, just that there are multiple paths, and I spent 20 years insisting mine was the only valid one, which meant yours had to be invalid. We talked for 2 hours that afternoon, the first real conversation we'd had since we were kids, before competition and comparison had poisoned the relationship. He'd ask questions about my career, my choices, my financial strategy, my life. Not questions designed to judge or compare, but questions that suggested actual curiosity about someone he'd never bothered to know. Near the end, he'd asked something that had been clearly building throughout the conversation. Does it bother you that I earn more annually but you're worth more overall? That my job gets media coverage but yours operates in silence? That people know my name but not yours? I'd thought about it, really considered it, because the question deserved honesty. No, because we're measuring different things. You measure success by visibility, by annual income, by recognition. I measure it by impact, by security, by knowing that what I do matters, even if no one applauds. Neither measurement is wrong, they're just different. I'd leaned forward then, making sure he heard what came next. But what bothered me, what hurt, wasn't that you chose different metrics. It was that you insisted your metrics were the only ones that counted. That anything unmeasurable by your standards had no value. He'd nodded, understanding landing in his expression. I won't make that mistake again. Whether he could follow through, whether old habits could truly change, remained uncertain. But the willingness to try, the acknowledgement of harm done, that was something. That was a start. My father had been the most surprising transformation. Richard Morgan, businessman and patriarch, man of certainty and fixed opinions, had proven more capable of change than I'd anticipated. He'd called one Thursday evening, his voice carrying unusual hesitation. I've been reading about your job, the command structure, the responsibilities, what a 2-star general actually does. And Rachel, I had no idea. The scope of it, the complexity, the level of trust required. He'd paused, gathering courage for what came next. I spent 30 years building a company with 200 employees. You command 20 times that many. I managed a budget of 30 million. You manage a budget 200 times larger. I answered to a board of directors. You answered to the Secretary of Defense and ultimately the President. Another pause, longer this time. And I treated you like you were underachieving because you weren't following my path. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but I am. I'm deeply, profoundly sorry. We'd talked regularly after that, my father approaching our conversations with the same systematic thoroughness he'd once applied to business problems. He'd wanted to understand the military structure, the career progression, the difference between combat arms and support functions and intelligence operations. He'd been genuinely fascinated by the strategic challenges I faced, the balance between operational security and congressional oversight, the complexity of coalition warfare and alliance management. In one conversation, he'd admitted something that explained much of his earlier behavior. I was scared for you. When you first enlisted, the wars were ongoing. I knew people whose children hadn't come home, and I couldn't protect you, couldn't use money or connections to keep you safe. So I convinced myself what you were doing wasn't important, because if it wasn't important, maybe it also wasn't dangerous. The psychology of it made sense. Fear transmuted into dismissal, anxiety masked as disapproval. He'd needed me to be doing something small and safe because the alternative, acknowledging that I was doing something large and risky, was too frightening for a father to bear. I didn't come home from those deployments because you couldn't protect me. I came home because I was well-trained, well-led, and careful. And yes, lucky, but mostly trained. The hardest conversation had come from an unexpected source. Patricia Patterson had finally worn me down through sheer persistence, leaving messages with my aide twice a week for 6 weeks until I'd finally agreed to meet her for coffee. Not because I'd forgiven her. Forgiveness required time and genuine change, but because her determination suggested something more than performative guilt. We'd met at a small cafe in Georgetown, early morning before the city fully woke, the kind of place where no one would recognize or care about 2 women talking over lattes. Patricia had looked smaller somehow, as if the certainty that had inflated her had leaked out, leaving someone more human and less assured. I don't expect you to forgive me. Her opening words had been direct, her eyes red-rimmed, her expensive jewelry notably absent. I don't even expect you to like me. but I need you to know that what I said, all of it haunts me." She'd pulled out her phone then, opened her notes app, showed me pages of entries, dates, times, things she'd said to me or about me over the years, cataloged with the systematic precision of someone doing penance. I've been writing down every instance I can remember of being condescending or dismissive, every assumption I made about you, every time I patted your hand and talked about finding your level or doing practical things. Why? Because I need to face it, all of it. I need to see the pattern clearly enough that I never repeat it. Not with you, not with anyone. She'd closed her phone, wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she needed the warmth. I was raised to believe that success looked a specific way. Money, visibility, social status. And anyone who chose differently was either unable to achieve those things or misguided in their priorities. It never occurred to me, truly never occurred to me, that someone might have completely different metrics that were equally valid. She'd looked up then, meeting my eyes. "You could have destroyed me that night. When the truth came out, you could have thrown every condescending thing I'd said back in my face. You could have humiliated me the way I'd humiliated you. But you didn't. No. Why not?" I'd considered the question, tracking back through my own motivations, my own choices in that moment. Because humiliation doesn't teach anything. It just breeds resentment. And because destroying you wouldn't have changed anything about my life or my value. It would have just been cruelty for cruelty's sake. Patricia had started crying then, quietly, tears running down her face unchecked. That's grace, real grace. The kind I've never shown anyone because I was too busy judging them by metrics they never agreed to. We talked for over an hour, Patricia asking questions similar to the ones my family had asked, but coming from a different place. Not family obligation or repair work, but genuine curiosity from someone whose worldview had been forcibly expanded. She'd wanted to know about my deployments, my responsibilities, what it meant to hold a security clearance, what it felt like to brief members of Congress on threats they couldn't discuss with their own staff. Near the end, she'd asked the question that seemed to be weighing on her most heavily. How do I raise my daughters differently? How do I teach them not to make the same mistakes I made? Teach them that success is multidimensional, that service matters as much as profit, that quiet competence is as valuable as visible achievement, that someone's worth isn't determined by what they drive or wear or how much money they make. I'd paused, then added something that felt important, and teach them to ask questions before making assumptions, to be curious about people's choices rather than judgmental, to respect that everyone's defining their own version of success, and none of those definitions need to match theirs. Patricia had left with new purpose, and while I doubted we'd ever be friends, I appreciated her willingness to confront her own behavior, to take responsibility without making excuses, to do the hard work of actual change rather than performative apology. David Patterson, by contrast, had sent a fruit basket with a note. "Deepest apologies for my thoughtless remarks. DP." I donated the fruit to the base commissary and recycled the note. Some people apologized because they were sorry. Others apologized because it was expected. His fell firmly in the latter category. The biggest change, though, had come at Christmas. My mother had called in early December with a request that had clearly been rehearsed. "Your father and I would like to host Christmas dinner this year, just immediate family, and we'd like you to come in uniform if you're comfortable with that. We want to celebrate you properly, the way we should have been celebrating you all along." The invitation had carried weight, intention, a clear signal that things were different now. I'd agreed, with one condition. No photographers, no social media. This isn't about showing people that you have a general for a daughter. It's about actually seeing your daughter, who happens to be a general. She'd agreed immediately, without hesitation or argument. Christmas morning had been cold and clear, frost coating the Connecticut landscape like powdered sugar, the kind of day that belonged on greeting cards. I'd driven up alone, my service dress blues pressed perfectly, my 2 stars catching morning light through the car windows. Brandon's Tesla was in the driveway again, but this time Melissa had ridden with him, their children in the back seat. My niece and nephew, who I'd barely known because family gatherings had always felt like endurance tests rather than celebrations. This time felt different, intentional, purposeful. My mother had opened the door before I reached it, and her face had done something I'd never seen before. It had lit up. Pure, uncomplicated pride and joy and love, the way mothers were supposed to look at their daughters, regardless of career choices or life paths. "Look at you, you're magnificent." She'd hugged me carefully, mindful of the uniform, and I'd let myself sink into it for a moment, let myself feel what I'd been missing for 20 years, a mother's unconditional pride. The house had been transformed, not in decor. The decorations were the same understated elegance they'd always been. But on the mantel, in places of prominence, were photographs I'd never seen displayed before. Me at my academy graduation, me pinning on captain's bars, me with my flight and deployment photos I didn't even know my parents had copies of. A formal portrait from when I'd made colonel, my face younger but already carrying the weight of command. Your father dug through everything we had. We realized we'd been hiding evidence of your career, the same way we'd been hiding from the truth of it. My father had come down the stairs then, Brandon and his family behind him, and he'd stopped halfway, just looking at me in uniform, taking in the full picture of who I was and what I'd become. "My daughter, the general." His voice had broken on the words, 20 years of missed recognition finally catching up to him. Brandon had brought his kids forward then, both of them wide-eyed at the uniform, at the stars, at the visible authority that they'd never associated with their aunt before. "These are mine. Emma's 8, Jake's 10. And they've been asking about you constantly since we told them what you really do." Emma had stepped forward first, bold despite her youth. "Are you really a general like in the movies?" "I'm really a general. Though real generals are a lot less dramatic than movie generals." "Do you fly planes?" "Not anymore. Now I command people who fly planes, and people who fix planes, and people who plan missions." Jake had found his courage then. "Dad says you're one of the most important people in the Air Force." Brandon's face had colored slightly, but he hadn't contradicted it, hadn't diminished it, had let the statement stand. "I have a lot of responsibility. But everyone in the military is important. We all serve together." We'd moved into the dining room then, the table set with the same china and crystal that had witnessed 20 years of difficult dinners. But this time the atmosphere was different, lighter, more honest. My father had asked me to sit at his right hand, the position of honor, rather than relegating me to the end of the table or with the children. Before we ate, he'd stood, glass raised. "I want to say something." The room had quieted, all eyes on him. 20 years ago, our daughter told us she was joining the Air Force. And for 20 years, we failed to understand what that meant. We failed to see her. We failed to recognize her accomplishments. We failed to celebrate her service. We were so committed to our own narrow definition of success that we couldn't see the extraordinary woman she'd become. His voice had roughened, emotion breaking through his usual controlled demeanor. "Rachel, you've served your country with distinction. You've risen to the highest levels of military leadership. You've protected us, protected millions of people who will never know your name or thank you for what you've done. You've done all of this with grace and dignity, and without needing our approval or recognition." He'd paused, lifted his glass higher. "But you have it now. You have our approval, our recognition, and most importantly, our profound respect. We're sorry it took so long. We're sorry we wasted 20 years being wrong when we could have spent them being proud." To Rachel, to General Morgan, to our daughter, who showed us that success comes in many forms, and the quietest forms are often the most meaningful. The toast had landed in my chest, heavy and healing, acknowledgement I'd stopped expecting, but never stopped wanting. Around the table, glasses lifted, and I'd seen genuine pride on their faces. Not pride in what I'd achieved for them, but pride in who I'd become for myself. Dinner had been different from every family meal that preceded it. Brandon's children had peppered me with questions about military life, deployments, what it was like to command thousands of people. My mother had wanted to know about the other women in senior military leadership, the challenges we faced, the support networks we'd built. My father had been curious about strategic decision-making at the flag officer level, the balance between military expertise and political reality. And Brandon had been quiet, listening more than talking, his usual need to dominate conversation replaced by genuine interest in learning about a sister he'd never bothered to know. Toward the end of dinner, Emma had asked a question that had stopped everyone. "Aunt Rachel, are you sad that you can't tell people about the important things you do?" The table had gone silent, everyone waiting for my answer. Curious how I'd explain operational security to an 8-year-old. Sometimes, but mostly no, because the important part isn't people knowing, the important part is the work getting done. If I do my job well, people stay safe, and their safety matters more than my recognition. Emma had considered this seriously, her young face thoughtful. That's like being a superhero but without the costume. I'd smiled at that, at the perfect simplicity of a child's understanding. Exactly like that. After dinner, my father had pulled me aside into his study, the same room where we'd had our difficult conversation 3 months earlier. But this time, he'd opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a leather folder. I want you to have this. Inside was the framed citation for my Defense Superior Service Medal that my mother had mentioned, along with several other awards and commendations he'd apparently been collecting and hiding for years. Evidence of my career that he'd kept but couldn't display. Recognition that existed in contradiction to his disappointment. I was wrong about all of it, about what matters, about how to measure a life well lived, about what makes me proud as a father. He'd placed the folder in my hands, his eyes wet. You've done more good in your 20 years of service than I did in 30 years of business. You've protected people, led people, served something bigger than profit margins and market share. And I was too stubborn and too committed to my own worldview to see it. Dad, let me finish. I need to say this. He'd taken a breath, gathered himself. You're everything a parent should want their child to be. Honorable, competent, dedicated to something meaningful. And I missed 20 years of being proud of you because I was too busy being disappointed that you weren't me. The confession had hung between us, raw and real and impossibly late, but somehow still meaningful. I forgive you. The words had come easier than expected. Not because the hurt was gone, but because holding on to it served no purpose. I forgive all of you. Not because what you did was okay, but because I'm tired of carrying it. And because you're actually trying to change, not just performing regret, but doing the work. He'd hugged me then, a real embrace. Not the stiff formal hugs from previous years, but something genuine and aching and healing. When I'd finally driven away that evening, the stars bright overhead despite the cold, my phone had buzzed with a text from Brandon. Thank you for giving us another chance, for believing we could be better. I won't waste it. I'd smiled at that. Bone-tired, but somehow lighter, the weight of being unseen finally replaced by something better. Not visibility as performance, but recognition as truth. The story would end there if this were fiction, with reconciliation complete and relationships healed, and everyone living happily ever after. But real life was messier, more complicated, full of ongoing work rather than neat resolutions. My family was trying, genuinely trying. But trying wasn't the same as arriving, and we had decades of patterns to unlearn. There would be backsliding, moments when old assumptions would resurface, times when visibility and recognition would still be measured by different metrics than the ones I used. But the difference now was awareness, willingness, commitment to doing better, to being better, to actually seeing me rather than the convenient fiction they'd constructed. 3 months after Christmas, on a cold March morning, I'd stood in Arlington National Cemetery for a funeral. A retired colonel I'd served with early in my career, a mentor who'd seen something in me when I was a young captain and had helped shape my understanding of leadership and service. His family had requested I speak at the service. The cemetery had been quiet, except for wind through bare trees, rows of white headstones stretching toward distant horizons, physical evidence of service rendered and lives dedicated to something beyond self. Standing at the podium, looking out at assembled mourners, military and civilian, young and old, people whose lives had been touched by a man most Americans would never know, I'd understood something fundamental. This was the inheritance of invisible service, not monuments or name recognition or visible glory, but impact that rippled outward, touching lives in ways that could never be fully measured or recognized. The colonel had shaped dozens of young officers who'd gone on to command thousands, who'd made decisions that affected millions, who'd protected systems and people and freedoms that most took for granted. His name would fade from memory within a generation, but his influence would persist, embedded in the officers he'd mentored, the strategies he'd developed, the culture of excellence he'd modeled. That was the choice I'd made 20 years ago. To do work that mattered more than it would ever be recognized. To serve in silence, in shadows, protecting people who would never know protection had been necessary. My family finally understood that choice, finally respected it, finally saw that success wasn't singular, wasn't defined by visibility or wealth or social status, but by impact and integrity and dedication to something larger than self. The funeral had ended with a 3-volley salute and taps, the haunting notes carrying across the cemetery, and I thought about the thousands of men and women buried here, most of them unknown to the nation they'd served, their sacrifices marked by simple white stones, and the knowledge that they'd done something that mattered. Afterward, standing in the parking lot, I'd checked my phone and found messages from my family. My mother asking if I was okay, knowing from my calendar that today was the funeral. My father sending a quote from Teddy Roosevelt about the man in the arena. Brandon sharing an article about women in military leadership with a note. Made me think of you. Small gestures, but gestures that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Evidence of change, of growth, of family relationships being rebuilt on foundations of honesty and respect, rather than assumption and disappointment. I'd driven back to my apartment, changed into civilian clothes, and met Colonel Martinez for dinner. She'd been my peer and friend for years, someone who understood the isolation of senior military leadership, the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field, the odd space of commanding authority while maintaining humility. Over wine and Italian food, we talked about the funeral, about leadership, about the strange reality of doing work that shaped history while remaining largely invisible to it. She'd asked the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind lately. Do you regret the silence? The 20 years of letting people think you were failing when you were actually succeeding? I'd thought about it, really considered it, because the question deserved more than a reflexive answer. No, because the silence was strategic. It protected my work. It let me focus on mission rather than managing my family's opinions. It taught me that external validation, while nice, isn't necessary. My worth wasn't dependent on their recognition. It existed independent of their understanding. But I regret that the silence was necessary, that they never cared enough to push past it, to actually see me, to respect that maybe I knew what I was doing even if they couldn't comprehend it. She'd nodded, understanding the distinction. And now that they know? Now they're trying. We're rebuilding. It's awkward and complicated and sometimes painful, but it's honest. And honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is better than comfortable fiction. We'd clinked glasses to that, to the messy reality of family relationships, to the ongoing work of reconciliation, to the understanding that some things couldn't be fixed quickly, but could be slowly mended with genuine effort and time. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I'd stood at the window looking out over Alexandria, lights stretching toward D.C. in the distance, the capital of the nation I'd served for 2 decades glowing against the dark sky. Somewhere in that city, decisions were being made that would affect millions of lives. Threats were being monitored. Strategies were being developed. Operations were being planned and executed. And most of the people doing that work, making those decisions, taking those risks, they were invisible, unknown. Their names would never appear in history books or on monuments. But their work mattered. Their service counted. Their dedication protected freedoms that others took for granted. I'd chosen that path. Chosen service over visibility. Chosen impact over recognition. Chosen to be the kind of successful that didn't require an audience, that didn't need validation, that existed whether anyone saw it or not. My family finally understood that now, finally respected it, finally saw me. But the truth was, I'd never needed them to. Their recognition was a gift, appreciated but not essential, because I'd always known who I was, what I'd accomplished, what my life meant. The world needs people who measure success by impact rather than income, by service rather than status, by integrity rather than visibility. It needs people willing to do important work in silence, to protect systems and lives and freedoms without requiring applause or acknowledgement. For 20 years, my family had seen me as a cautionary tale, a woman who'd chosen wrong, who'd wasted her potential, who'd failed to achieve anything meaningful because her achievements couldn't be displayed at dinner parties or measured in stock portfolios. They'd been looking at a general and seeing a failure, looking at leadership and seeing inadequacy, looking at service and seeing waste. But the failure wasn't mine. It was theirs. A failure of imagination, a failure of curiosity, a failure to understand that the most important work often happens where no one can see it, done by people whose names no one will remember, protecting systems that most people never think about. Now they knew, now they saw, now they understood. And that was good. That mattered. That would change our relationships going forward, would let us build something honest and real and mutually respectful. But even if they'd never known, even if the Metropolitan Club incident had never happened, even if I'd carried their misconceptions to my grave, my life would still have had meaning. My work would still have mattered. My service would still have protected people who never knew protection was necessary. Because true success, the kind that actually matters, doesn't require an audience. It doesn't need recognition. It exists in the work itself, in the impact made, in the lives touched and protected and improved. My family finally understood that. But more importantly, I'd always understood it. And that understanding, that certainty about my own worth and my own choices, that was the real victory, not the revelation, not the recognition, but the knowledge that I'd spent 20 years being exactly who I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do, succeeding by my own metrics, regardless of their opinions. Silence isn't absence. Silence is choice. Silence is strength dressed in satin, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that you were never weak. You were simply wise enough to know that your power didn't require their permission to exist. I'd been a general when they thought I was a failure. I'd been successful when they thought I was struggling. I'd been everything I'd wanted to be, whether they could see it or not. The stars on my shoulders proved it, but I'd never needed proof. I'd always known, and now finally they knew too.